The Ghost Ships of the Arctic, the Franklin Expedition. Researchers found a handwritten note sealed inside a cairn of stones on a remote Arctic island, and what it said confirmed that one of the most celebrated expeditions in British history had become one of the most complete disasters in the history of exploration. But to understand how it ended, you have to start at the beginning. At the docks of Greenhithe, England, on the 19th of May 1845, two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, left Britain that spring under the command of Sir John Franklin, a veteran Arctic explorer with 4 previous expeditions behind him. Their mission was to complete the Northwest Passage, the long-sought sea route through the Arctic archipelago that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and, in theory, open a new highway of trade to Asia. The expedition was the best equipped Britain had ever sent north. The ships had been reinforced against ice with iron plating and internal timber strengthening. They carried locomotive steam engines, technology so new it had barely been applied to ships before, to push through ice when wind failed. They carried provisions for 3 years: canned meat, canned vegetables, canned soup, enough food to sustain 129 men through the long months of polar winter. The public confidence in Franklin's success was enormous. Newspapers ran enthusiastic coverage. The Admiralty was certain. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, organized farewell dinners. The expedition was the Victorian age in concentrated form: technology, empire, and absolute confidence in both. The last confirmed sighting of the ships came in late July of 1845, when 2 whaling vessels encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, waiting for ice conditions to improve. The whalers reported that the men were healthy and confident. They exchanged pleasantries. The ships continued north into the ice, and then, completely, they were gone. No signal, no messenger, no emergency return. Through the winters of 1845, 1846, and 1847, not a single word reached the outside world. It was not until 1848 that Britain began to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Archives found at the British National Maritime Museum contain over 1,000 pages of correspondence generated by the search for the Franklin expedition. Letters, petition transcripts, expedition reports, and one extraordinary document signed by Lady Jane Franklin herself, addressed to the Prime Minister and demanding action. Franklin's ships were expected to return by 1848 at the latest. When they did not, Lady Jane began a campaign of persistent political pressure that resulted in more than 30 separate search expeditions being dispatched to the Arctic between 1848 and 1859. The Admiralty posted a reward of £20,000, equivalent to several $1 million today, for information leading to the rescue or confirmed fate of the 129 men. The search parties found things, gradually, that told a partial and deeply disturbing story. In 1850, on Beechey Island in the Canadian Arctic, searchers found evidence of a winter camp and 3 graves. 3 of Franklin's men who had died during the expedition's first winter in 1845 and 1846. The graves were marked and appeared to have been prepared with care. The men had been given a proper burial. Whatever had been happening at that point, the expedition was still organized and functioning. Then, in 1859, a search party led by Francis Leopold McClintock found what is now known as the Victory Point Note. It was a standard Admiralty form, the kind carried on all Royal Navy expeditions for exactly this purpose. A printed template onto which information about the ship's location and status could be written and then sealed into a cairn for future searchers to find. The note had been written in 2 stages. The first message, dated April 1847, reported that the expedition was in good condition. Franklin was in command, and the ships had navigated a significant stretch of the passage successfully. Around the margins, a second message had been added in a different hand, dated April 1848. Franklin was dead. The ships had been trapped in ice for a year and a half. The surviving officers were abandoning the vessels and marching overland toward the Back River. 105 men were still alive at that point. None of them would be seen again. Scientists found a man perfectly preserved in the permafrost of Beechey Island in 1984, and when they looked at his face, they were looking at someone who had been dead for 138 years. Dr. Owen Beattie, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Alberta, led a research team to the Beechey Island burial site in the early 1980s with a specific scientific objective: to recover physical samples from the 3 graves found there in 1850 and use them to investigate the causes of the expedition's failure. The excavation of the grave of Petty Officer John Torrington, who had died in January of 1846 at the age of 20, produced one of the most striking images in the history of Arctic exploration. The permafrost had preserved him almost completely. His features were recognizable, his hair was intact, his clothing, the blue striped shirt and grey wool trousers in which he had been buried, had survived 138 years underground without significant degradation. Photographs taken during the excavation were published worldwide. The image of Torrington's preserved face, slightly bluish from the cold, eyes partially open, generated both intense scientific interest and considerable public reaction. He looked like someone who had been asleep for a very long time. The physical examination conducted during the excavation found that Torrington had been a small man, underweight, showing signs of nutritional deficiency, with evidence of significant lung disease. He had not been a healthy person when he boarded Erebus in 1845. Whatever had happened to the expedition, he had gone into it already compromised. The scientific team took tissue samples, hair, bone, soft tissue where it had survived, and brought them back to the laboratory. What those samples revealed about the cause of Torrington's death, and about the condition of the men around him, would reframe the entire understanding of what had destroyed the Franklin expedition. The question written at the top of every analysis report was the same. How did 129 trained, well-supplied men disappear so completely and so quickly? Laboratory analysis found lead levels in John Torrington's hair and bone tissue that were 10 times higher than background levels typical of Victorian-era Englishmen. And that finding opened an investigation that traced the contamination directly to the expedition's food supply. Hair analysis is a useful tool in forensic toxicology because hair grows at a measurable rate, approximately 1 centimeter per month, and incorporates whatever is in the bloodstream at the time of each segment's formation. A strand of hair is essentially a timeline of what has been inside a person's body. The lead distribution across Torrington's hair indicated that his exposure had been ongoing and had increased in the period leading up to his death. The source was identified through physical examination of the expedition's food supply system. The Franklin expedition had relied heavily on industrially canned food, sealed into tin canisters using solder that contained a significant proportion of lead. The soldering had been done hastily. Examination of surviving cans showed thick, uneven bead lines along the interior seams, in some cases depositing lead directly into the food contents. The lead would have entered the men's systems continuously with every meal. Its effects, accumulating over months, included cognitive impairment, weakening of muscle coordination, mood instability, and progressive deterioration in the ability to make sound decisions. This was not the only medical threat. Analysis of the remains found evidence of tuberculosis, a disease that was widespread in Victorian England and that the rigors of Arctic conditions would have accelerated significantly. There was also evidence of scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that was a known hazard of long sea voyages and that compromises the immune system and physical resilience. Lead poisoning. Tuberculosis, scurvy, Three separate and compounding conditions, each serious on its own, interacting in men who were also cold, isolated, and trapped in ice in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The question of whether the lead poisoning affected command decisions made in 1848, including the decision to abandon 2 sturdy ships and march across open Arctic terrain in April, has been debated in the scientific literature ever since. The answer, most researchers now believe, is almost certainly yes. Forensic scientists found bone fragments on King William Island in the Canadian Arctic that had lain exposed on the tundra for over 170 years. And in 2021 and 2024, DNA technology finally gave some of those fragments names. The bones on King William Island presented a specific forensic challenge. They had been found scattered across a large area, mixed together, many fragmentary, exposed to decades of Arctic weather. The Victory Point note had told researchers where the survivors were heading when they abandoned the ships in April 1848. King William Island was on their intended route. The bones confirmed they had not made it far. The problem was identification. Standard DNA profiling requires intact, well-preserved genetic material. Arctic conditions had partially degraded the samples, making conventional extraction techniques unreliable. The researchers used a more sensitive approach, shotgun sequencing of the ancient DNA, combined with targeted enrichment methods to pull out enough readable genetic material to construct partial genetic profiles. Those profiles were then compared against a database built specifically for this project. DNA samples voluntarily provided by documented descendants of Franklin expedition crew members, traced through genealogical research to living relatives in the United Kingdom. In 2021, a positive identification was made for the first time in the history of the Franklin investigation. The bones were matched to John Gregory, the engineer aboard HMS Erebus. Gregory had a documented family line, and a living descendant had provided a reference sample. The mitochondrial DNA matched. In 2024, researchers announced a second identification of even greater historical significance. The remains of James Fitzjames, the captain of HMS Erebus himself, had been identified among the King William Island bone scatter. Fitzjames was the most senior officer known to have been among the men who abandoned the ships. His DNA had been matched to a living descendant through the same process. For the first time, the bones had names, and the names were real. Forensic scientists found cut marks on the bones from King William Island that no one in Victorian England had been willing to accept, and that the physical evidence made impossible to dispute. The cut marks were identified in the 1990s by researchers including anthropologist Anne Keenlyside, who examined the bone assemblage from King William Island under high-powered analysis. The marks had specific characteristics that distinguished them from animal gnawing, from tool damage during excavation, and from environmental weathering. They were consistent with the use of a sharp blade on bone, specifically with the kind of precise, purposeful cuts made when separating meat from bone for consumption. The implication was clear. Some of the men who had died during the overland march had been consumed by those who were still alive. This was not a new claim. Inuit oral accounts, collected by the explorer John Ray in 1854, had described finding bodies that showed evidence of being used as food. Ray had reported these accounts to the British Admiralty, and the response in England had been explosive. Not in acknowledgement, but in denial. Charles Dickens, one of the most prominent public voices of the Victorian era, wrote a lengthy article specifically to discredit the Inuit accounts, suggesting that the witnesses were unreliable and that the noble officers of the Royal Navy were incapable of such acts. The bone analysis vindicated the Inuit testimony more than a century after it was given. The physical evidence was precise, methodologically verified, and unambiguous in its interpretation. The cut marks were not accidental. They were purposeful. The psychological reality of what the survivors faced, starving, cold, cognitively impaired by lead poisoning, far beyond any possibility of rescue, is not simple to describe. What the evidence establishes is that some of them tried everything available to them to stay alive. That is a human fact, not a moral failing. And the scientific confirmation of that fact was a form of truth that the Victorian world had refused to allow. Sonar data found in Parks Canada's survey archives from 2014 showed an anomaly on the floor of Queen Maud Gulf, a shape that was too regular, too structured to be geological. It was HMS Erebus, and it was in extraordinary condition. The search for the Franklin ships had been ongoing in various forms since the 1980s. The Canadian government had conducted systematic sonar surveys of the relevant Arctic sea routes, covering enormous areas of shallow sea bottom in the search for any trace of the two vessels. Inuit oral traditions, the same traditions that had been dismissed in 1854, were incorporated into the search planning, providing guidance on where ships had been seen drifting and where ice conditions had been observed. The 2014 discovery of Erebus was made in a location consistent with Inuit accounts that described a ship sinking in that general area. The wreck was found at a depth of approximately 11 meters, lying on its keel, with its hull largely intact and many of its internal structures still in place. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was found in Terror Bay, a location whose name had been given by Inuit communities long before the wreck was discovered, and whose oral tradition had described a ship being deliberately guided into the bay and anchored there. The wreck was found in even better condition than Erebus, with hatches closed and internal spaces that appeared sealed rather than chaotically abandoned. Remotely operated underwater vehicles sent into both wrecks recorded detailed footage of the interiors. They found plates, cutlery, personal effects, and, in the case of Terror, a cabin believed to be the captain's quarters, with furnishings that remained largely in their original position. The separation of the two ships, found nearly 100 kilometers apart, confirms that the crew had divided after the abandonment of the vessels, or that the ships had drifted separately after being released from the ice. Exactly what sequence of events connected the Victory Point note in April 1848 to the scattered bones of King William Island remains the central unresolved question of the Franklin investigation. Journals found in British naval archives from officers who served on earlier Arctic expeditions provide the closest available picture of what daily life aboard HMS Erebus would have looked like during the long months of polar winter, and what the men would have done to maintain their psychological stability in conditions of extraordinary deprivation. The Franklin expedition carried a library of over 1,000 books. It carried theatrical costumes and stage sets for amateur performances. It carried a hand organ that could play 50 tunes. These were not luxuries. They were standard provisions for long Arctic missions, because naval commanders had learned from experience that boredom, isolation, and darkness were themselves threats to crew cohesion and effectiveness. During the winter months, when ice locked the ships in place and sunlight was absent for weeks at a time, the men would have lived by artificial light, maintaining ship routines to preserve structure and discipline. Officers gave lectures. Crew members competed in games and contests. The band played. The expedition's relationship with the Inuit people it encountered has been re-examined extensively in recent decades. The Inuit of the central Canadian Arctic had lived successfully in exactly the environment that was killing the Franklin men. They had detailed, sophisticated knowledge of how to hunt, navigate, build shelter, and travel across sea ice that the British sailors did not possess, and, critically, did not seek to learn. Multiple Inuit accounts describe encounters with the men from the ships. Some accounts describe attempts at communication that ended in mutual incomprehension. Others describe men who appeared confused, physically diminished, and unable to understand why their survival strategies were failing. Franklin had brought 3 years of canned food. The Inuit had lived in the same environment for generations. The refusal to learn from people who already knew is one of the defining features of the Franklin expedition's failure. And it is a feature rooted in the assumptions of Victorian imperial culture rather than any lack of practical alternatives. Government documents found in Library and Archives Canada show that the Canadian search for the Franklin ships between 2008 and 2014 cost approximately $8 million, and that the official justification for the expenditure included not only historical research, but explicit references to Canadian Arctic sovereignty. The Franklin expedition has a political dimension that is rarely discussed in popular accounts, but that explains why governments continue to invest in research more than 175 years after the ships disappeared. Canada's claim to sovereignty over the Arctic archipelago, including the Northwest Passage itself, is grounded partly in the argument of continuous historical presence and exploration. The Franklin ships sank in Canadian Arctic waters. The search expeditions that followed them were conducted by ships sailing through those waters. The wrecks, once found, were declared heritage sites under Canadian law. The ongoing research into the expedition is, from one angle, a geopolitical act. The assertion that Canada has a documented historical relationship with a region that multiple countries, including Russia, the United States, and Denmark, have interests in claiming or contesting. Norway's sustained interest in Franklin research connects to its own Arctic exploration tradition. Roald Amundsen, the first navigator to successfully complete the Northwest Passage, did so in 1903 to 1906, in part by learning from the Inuit the survival techniques that Franklin's men had refused. The Norwegian engagement with Franklin is, in part, a study in what the alternative approach looks like. In popular culture, the expedition has generated an unusually rich body of creative work. The 2018 AMC television series, The Terror, based on Dan Simmons's novel, introduced the story to millions of viewers in the United States, Germany, and the UK who had no prior knowledge of it. Podcast series in multiple countries have covered the investigation, with new DNA findings consistently generating fresh cycles of listener interest. The Franklin case has also been cited in planning documents for long-duration space missions, specifically as a case study in the psychological and physiological risks of isolated, resource-limited environments from which return is not guaranteed. Researchers found, when they compiled the complete body of evidence accumulated since 1984, the forensic toxicology, the DNA identifications, the wreck discoveries, the underwater archaeology, that the Franklin expedition had gone from being a Victorian mystery to being one of the best documented forensic cases in the history of exploration. The DNA identifications announced in 2021 and 2024 changed the nature of the case in a specific way. Before those identifications, the men of the Franklin expedition were collectively present in the historical record, but individually anonymous. 129 names on a manifest, without faces or physical traces that could be tied to specific individuals. The bones on King William Island were bones. They could tell you what happened to the bodies. They could not tell you whose bodies they were. The identification of John Gregory and James Fitzjames gave 2 of those 129 men their physical presence back. Gregory had been an engineer, a working man, not an officer, whose name would not have appeared prominently in official dispatches. Fitzjames had been the captain of Erebus and the most senior officer among the survivors after Franklin's death. Both men now had confirmed graves in the form of archaeological context rather than a headstone. Both had living descendants who had contributed to the identification. In 2009, a formal reburial ceremony was held for previously recovered remains, conducted with the participation of the Royal Canadian Navy and representatives of the Inuit community, whose oral tradition had preserved knowledge of the expedition for 160 years. The ceremony was an acknowledgement, overdue by a century and a half, that the Inuit had been telling the truth from the beginning. The location of Franklin's own grave remains unknown. He died in June of 1847, before the ships were abandoned, and his burial site has never been found. The man whose name the expedition carried, whose decisions set the course, whose ambition drove the ships north, he is the one the DNA has not yet reached. That question remains open, and the Arctic, as always, is not in a hurry to answer.